Some new elements have been added to the Optic and Hex saga, as this has been a very long-running subject up to this point during the CDL off-season, and it seems as if we may or may have not learned some more information today, as Esports Talk's own Jake released a video talking on how some credible sources have let him know some further information in regards to Hex's acquirement of the Los Angeles Optic spot. So we've discussed this a little bit previously, what this could mean to kind of bring everybody very, very quickly up to speed. Essentially, the news that we have kind of learned is that Hex is in the middle or has already acquired the Los Angeles Optic Gaming spot. From there, the information was kind of up in the air, right? Would he kind of go over to LA and kind of control that team? Would he leave NRG? Could we possibly see him, and this was kind of my interpretation, would he essentially buy the Los Angeles Optic spot, have rights to the Optic Gaming name, then transfer that to the Huntsmen, so that essentially the Chicago Huntsmen would be rebranded to the Chicago Optic. The LA spot would then either be named as the Los Angeles Huntsmen, or maybe another team would come along and try and rename it. Maybe the Huntsman name would remain with NRG and Hex. Maybe they would call that something else. Maybe they would be able to do something with the name of Huntsman. So essentially, again, this kind of adds a new element to what has been an ongoing conversation for a while. And essentially, we'll kind of go very, very kind of point by point in terms of what he discussed, what his credible source has alluded him to, which essentially starts off with that the league may not allow for the Los Angeles spot to be renamed, meaning that Chicago must remain as the Huntsman, LA must remain as Optic. And again, that's what my interpretation was whenever this first had released, and that seems to kind of be the case, right? Hex wanted to keep it with Chicago Huntsmen. However, he wanted to buy the Optic Gaming spot so that he could then have the name transferred over here to Chicago. You have Chicago Optic, and then maybe you have the LA Huntsmen, or maybe another team comes along and changes it. Now, the source has released that NRG and Hex very well could, in fact, sell the Chicago Huntsman CDL spot, and thus would be in sole ownership of the Los Angeles Optic, or OGLA, instead, so that they could in fact have that name back. So again, what this kind of indicates is that the CDL has essentially blocked, and this is all speculation, by no means confirmed, but what seems to be the case from this credible source is that the CDL is not allowing for that name or that renaming to occur. So Huntsman must stay under the Chicago brand, Optic must stay under the LA brand. So if you are Hex in this situation, you're owning two franchise spots. Your goal is to transfer one kind of element to the other, the one that you have already had purchase of, and now you're kind of in the situation where it's like, hey, what goes on with Chicago Optic, or excuse me, what goes on with Chicago Huntsman, what goes on with the LA Optic? And so in this moment, it seems as if the CDL, at least for now, is at least not making this process easy, or at the very least is not going to allow for this process to take place. And essentially what this kind of instantly made me think of is a very similar situation to what Hex was in just months ago, right? Or not months ago, but a year ago, where he has kind of built up this brand. Again, Huntsman, by no means as big of a brand as the original Optic Gaming team was, but essentially kind of builds up this brand and then has to sell it off, right? And this very well could be the same thing. Now, another detail for what this source has released was that Nadeshot essentially was at the top of the list when it came down to the Chicago Huntsmen being sold. And then this kind of rumor had went on to, or rather this source had went on to say that essentially Nade had gone to the Envytv board, and at this moment it is not looking great for them to possibly purchase the Chicago spot for the CDL. And for those that are aware of it, Nade has obviously kind of grown up in Chicago. That's where he's from, has a lot of ties to Illinois specifically, a lot of ties specifically to that area, as that's obviously where he grew up. And then obviously we talk about the Envytv. They're based currently in California. They're based kind of in the LA market, so it would have made sense previously if kind of in the first iteration of this story that Hex, buys the Optic Gaming spot, he then sells LA to maybe Envytv, and then now obviously if this is starting to be the case, maybe Nade could be interested in Chicago as well. So it's kind of a double dealing of LA and Chicago, probably the two most interesting cities for Nade and possibly Envytv as well. So in short, It seems as if the league will not allow for the Huntsmen to be rebranded. Chicago Huntsmen may be sold while Optic Gaming is held on to by NRG. So again, this was kind of a big conversation, and I know there's a lot of elements to this. But another element to this was, well, is Hex going to leave the Chicago Huntsmen and NRG to essentially now hold ownership of the Optic Gaming LA spot? And now it seems, based off of this report, that Hex and NRG are not in fact splitting, but they are in fact in agreement of selling now Chicago Huntsmen, because that cannot be rebranded, and they are now interested as a party together to then now transfer over to Optic Gaming LA. And then in terms of this move specifically, which we'll talk about them kind of more in depth, but what does this mean for the players? And kind of in this video, it was indicated that, in terms of the Huntsman players, would that mean that Scump, Dashy, Envoy, and Formal are kind of up for bid, right? You're thinking about the brands that these guys have. I mean, the Huntsman in general was, I think, by far one of the, if not the most successful brand last season in the CDL. If you are a franchise owner or a team that wants to be in the CDL, a big key player that wants to be in Call of Duty, you're thinking, hey, I get the Chicago Huntsman brand, which we've learned previously is not as nearly not as valuable without Hex behind it, the person who grows it. But at the very least, you do get something, right? You do get some of those staff. And when we talk about the players specifically, you would get these names. You would get Scump's name specifically. But I will say in this situation, and I have obviously been wrong before, this is very true, I don't think this happens. And when I say I don't think this happens, I don't think that the Huntsman current players, if Hex and NRG were to go over to Optic Gaming LA, so they leave Chicago, it's gone, right? They are now selling that. I don't think that the players are then put in that deal, meaning that I think what occurs is a very unique situation. And again, the CDO could possibly block this. There could be contract details that essentially indicate that Scump, Dashy, Envoy, Formal, General, whoever is kind of signed officially to this team, cannot transfer to Optic Gaming LA because they could technically be under, the Huntsman. But I think if you are the person who has essentially taken care of that contract, and you are the franchise, and you have full ownership over two positions, I believe that Hex & Co. would be able to transfer those players to wherever they go. So I think where Hex goes, essentially that's where Scump and the rest of the team would go as well. So I don't believe, and I could be very well wrong on this, I don't believe that it could be Hex versus Scump next season. I think that it will always be Hex and Scump alongside each other. Now, if that cannot happen, if what I'm saying is not true, or that this could not happen, that would be pretty crazy, right? That would be one of the craziest things. Probably the biggest thing moving into next season would be this idea of Hex yet again builds up another franchise, builds up another brand in the Chicago Huntsmen. He then goes over to LA to reclaim the Optic Gaming name, and Scump & Co. are not able to join alongside of him. So you'd have Scump versus Hex, and that would be insane to think about. Now, what I believe is that if this were to occur, and again, they cannot be on the same team, or those contracts cannot transfer over to LA, which I believe that they could be wrong. The only person that I could realistically see Scump and the others willing to play for would be 100 Thieves, right? It would be under Nadeshot, because they know they'd be taken care of. 100 Thieves has obviously had a successful tenure in Call of Duty when they rejoined, obviously kind of back in especially Black Ops 4, that kind of time period. When they were in that title, it was known the players were well taken care of. Obviously, Nate has a massive history with Scump. He has a history with Formal specifically. And I think that those guys, they would be comfortable playing for someone like him if this does in fact have to take place. But I don't know if, given the circumstances right now, the Chicago Huntsmen players are like, cool, well, we'll just kind of play for anybody that comes along. Because we know that previously, when Optic Gaming was in this issue with Infinite, it was this situation of Hex really doesn't have control anymore. And so if you are in this situation yet again, where Hex does not have control over the Chicago Huntsmen players because he is elsewhere, not even tied to the brand anymore, I think that this could cause some major issues within the team. Now, again, contracts could be a thing. And I don't know what that means for Scump's career. I don't know what that means for the rest of the team in terms of their wanting to play with another, or rather play with each other. It cannot be as big of a deal as I'm making it. But again, we've been through this situation before, and it hasn't been a good one. And so I think, again, if you have 100 Thieves that come in, it makes it easier. But I do believe that those contracts will transfer. That is my belief if this source, even in the first place, is true. And then the overall transfer of this source does kind of make sense when you think about it. That was kind of a thought that when this original report had occurred, it was in my mind that this could be happening, where maybe the Chicago Huntsmen, that name, isn't able to transfer, or, the Optic name isn't able to transfer to Chicago. I was under the impression that the CDL would allow that to occur. Again, we've seen that with sports franchises before. One name in particular, Los Angeles Lakers. They haven't always been called the Lakers, folks. That name has transferred over from other, franchises in different cities. So I was under the impression that they would allow it, given the name of Optic, what that means, what that would do for the CDL. But I'm not unaware of the ruling behind it and what that would mean for the CDL in terms of allowing for teams to rebrand. Again, there are a lot of implications that would come from this decision, despite what could look like an obvious one. So I'm not unaware of that. But the transfer from NRG to California, and Hex as well, it makes sense, right? Not only is it an LA market, but you talk about NRG already. They already own the San Francisco Shock, a team that's been incredibly successful in the Overwatch League, at least in terms of victories. And then we talk about Andy Miller, who is obviously, a CEO of NRG. He is also a co-owner of the Sacramento Kings. So you have San Francisco, you already have Sacramento, and then with this LA spot, it would just kind of make sense. So again, I think this transfer, if it is a credible source, which I'm assuming, I'll kind of take Jake's word for it, in terms of esports talk, I think that this does have some real leverage to it and some real legs to it, given the current motion of what's going on right now. But my only thing is that it would be hard for me to imagine Scump without Hex, not just from like an emotion standpoint, obviously, but in terms of, would that actually take place, right? Would that actually not be able to occur? And if you are in Hex's position, you may run into a situation where it's like, hey, either Scump's coming with me, or it's Optic and Scump's going to have to wait a while, right? And I just don't. I think that he pulls it off. I do. I think that Hex is able to pull this off, where the contracts are able to transfer. I think that since they did write them in the first place, obviously that has to go through the CDL, but they're already obviously in talks with the CDL right now. If the name cannot transfer, I just think that due to that relationship already existing, I believe that those players could in fact transfer over to Optic LA. Now, what happens to the OGLA players? Another story, right? Does that instantly get transferred to Chicago? If you are technically in direct ownership of two spots, do you have to release those players as free agents? Can you kind of control what two teams are doing at once? No idea, right? That could be, maybe we bring in a contract expert to talk on those details, kind of in further, maybe in a further time. But still, a major story, a major advancement in terms of what Hex and NRG could in fact be doing in regards to possibly selling the Chicago Huntsmen and transferring over their operations from the Chicago Huntsmen then to Optic Gaming LA. And again, a lot of details kind of roll with that. That is kind of my current reaction to things, and I'm very interested to see exactly how this story all begins to come together as Cold War is rapidly approaching.